Sometimes in life, you get an interesting question. Sometimes that question is, where is all the iron brew gone? Trust me, I've asked that one a lot recently. Sometimes that question is, why are you having to push your car? Again, answered that one quite a lot recently. And sometimes you get the question, or rather an almost theological and philosophical debate, of what is a world war? Now, here is the interesting question. Because ultimately, that is the big question of this whole discussion on the 7 Years' War. The people who were talking about the 7 Years' War, who were writing about the 7 Years' War, they were treating it as a world war. It was a world war by their scale. It was a world war if you read history forwards. The trouble is, it stops being a world war if you look at what I would argue are total wars. And there's even a bit of a point at which way you can argue whether certain wars are total wars. Because total wars get the title of world wars, because that's setting them apart. But no one wants to call them total wars, because that sounds weird. It's a total war. Really? But the other wars were half-hearted efforts? Because that gets into you in trouble. Because when you define something as a total war, again, that is a relatively modern phrase. And it reflects, our ability to use machines and other efficiencies to increase the growth of food, the amount of food that people can produce per person, and also the industrial output per person, and the warfighting capability per person. So therefore you get to go, well, we have shifted so much more of our people to fight a war than we previously would have done. Which looks great, but that's industrialization. That's a product of that. It's not willingness to fight a war. That's not your commitment to a war. And I have to admit, there are some comments that have come on live, which I can understand where they're coming from, and I'm presuming there is a level of hyperbole. And I won't name who said this, because, the meaning is not about a list of all the squalid little places where a corporal's guard had a fight. I'm fairly certain that's hyperbole, because the battles I was listing off in the live, and that are going to feature in the background of this long patrol, they involved a lot more than a corporal's guard. A lot more. I'm sorry. My thinking is, once you've got general officers and generals, officers and land troops of sufficient quantity, that generals are being deployed around the world, and you have admirals with fleets going around the world, it pretty much becomes a world war. I would say it becomes a world war once you have actions going on in pretty much every major theatre. If you said all of them, then you'd have to wait till someone was fighting a battle in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and, well, that's not likely. But if you've got battles going on in Southeast Asia, India, the Indian Ocean, Africa, Mediterranean, the South Atlantic, the North Atlantic, even parts of the Pacific, the Caribbean, South America, North America, and all the way through Europe, does sound like a world war. And that's the thing. The definition for world war came about before the world wars did. That's the reality of the history, if you read it forward. That is the point. People were thinking about a world war before wars were called a world war. In reality, World War One and World War Two are paper names. They are what have been attached to this. It's like the 7 Years' War really should be the 9 Years' War, and that also caused another debate because some point out, well, there'd already been another war which was called the 9 Years' War, and well, you know, well, you couldn't have two wars named the same. Well, you can have two wars named the same. And actually, very kindly, when I responded to the person that you could, they came back at almost me and went, yeah, I suppose, yes, you could actually. Could have 9 Years' War, second edition. And it was interesting that it did cause these debates, because that is the point, in some respects, for me, of doing these videos. And I am going to be slightly naughty, because I have to admit, with pretty much all the lives through December, other than this one, other than the 7 Years' War, they are coming from you. They're coming from patrons, and I'll be announcing that at the end. They are coming from the suggestions from you, so I haven't put them forward. Which always makes me feel a bit guilty, because I feel half the point of this is I put forward some of my suggestions. And I maybe introduce more people to topics which they might not have considered. And that's where these debates come from, I hope. These debates about the nature and the meaning of a war, the nature and meaning of what is a world war, what is a total war, what is the reality of these things, comes about because of that, because of those things. But I'm also quite glad, because the comments suggest I have quite an eclectic mix of viewers who do have a range of knowledge. Although there was some interesting debates there. I would also say this: in the late 18th century, i.e. the 1700s, the 7 Years' War takes place. I am not sure that, and some commentators put us, that China could still be viewed as the greatest power in the world at this point. There is a problem for China in being viewed as the greatest power in the world. As rich and as powerful as they might have been, they had stratified quite and stagnated quite severely by this point. So they had a lot of power on paper, but it's kind of like Francis I and the first of France. Is it Francis I? I think so. And Henry VII. On paper, Francis is massively wealthy. He has all these estates. He has all these incomes, and that impresses historians. We'd like to write long articles about this, about the glory and greatness of him. But in terms of money, Henry VII had vast rooms, chambers, basements filled with it. And that impressed contemporaries. Because whilst Francis, in theory, has more power and has more capability, with Henry it's tangible. Francis on paper can command large armies. Henry VII, he doesn't tend to lose when he commands an army. If he needs to raise one, he raises and equips a very well equipped and very well trained one and does the job. Then gets rid of it as quickly as possible. And yes, I'm having to drink Coke out of my own brew glass. Life is terrible. First world problems. First world problems. But That doesn't mean, though, that Francis was weak or that Henry was weak. It means there's a difference. Both are powerful, but in different ways. And this is also another reason why I even today, when and even during the period when the world was described as a unipolar world, I didn't like and don't like the designation of most powerful or greatest nation on earth. I don't like those because it all is a matter of perspective. In the 1750s and 1760s, I think it is hard to argue that China has any kind of reach outside of China. That China has any influence much beyond its borders because of its own internal issues and because of its own stagnation and policy, especially in terms of the maritime sphere. Which, interestingly enough, the modern China seems to be eschewing. But we will see how long that lasts for. Remember, this is a nation which has, in the past, built up great nation and navies that have lasted for a couple of generations, and then people stop funding them. Because of internal issues. And there are always internal issues to worry about in a nation the size of China, or the size of America, or Russia. Because let's be honest, the Russian Navy was built up into a romping, stomping navy that was at many times touted as being bigger than the US Navy in the Cold War. Or feared to be bigger than the US Navy, or bigger than the US Navy in this area of operations. And then internal issues hit, economic crises hit, and Russia was no more. The Soviet Union was no more. Russia is now resurgent, we are told, but honestly, did it ever really go away, or was it just dealing with internal issues and not seeking an external solution to them? It's always fun when nations do that. There is also another problem when we start down the route of going total war, global war, world war, apart from them all having names. And there is an interesting thing in that global war has become to mean something different than world war. World war is a war which is fought around the world in the various places. A global war is a war which spans the globe, but might not necessarily be fought by that many different players and that many different nations in that many different places. I.e., it was the global war on terror, which was both at the same time spread out and incredibly confined. I'm not too sure on that last that last debate. Honestly, there is part of me which sometimes thinks that the think tanks, the academics in the universities, and the professional military education groups and the professional military officers, those of them who have time, are sort of trying to put in distinctions because that allows things to be new. But the thing about the 7 Years' War that's really interesting, and why I think it does form the basis of World War, and why I do think it is in that category, is that new paradigms do emerge. Is that it does change the scene. There is the world of international relations and politics and warfare as is understood prior to the 7 Years' War. Yes, we have seen facets of what goes on in the 7 Years' War happen in other wars, most probably the War of Jenkins' Ear, etc. All these things have happened before, to a lesser or greater extent. But this is the first time we have a war where we have it joined up, where we have all parties trying to engage in this kind of warfare. To a lesser or greater extent, to a lesser or greater success. I would argue it sets the scene for what comes later with the American War of Independence. I would argue it sets the scene for a lot of the issues that would shape Canada. I would argue it sets the scene for a lot of the world that comes from the next 100 years. And I think this is the point. There are two really forms of paradigms. And paradigm changing. There is when you form new paradigms and everyone's happy. And there is when you destroy old paradigms and now the world is unsettled. And that's a paradigm in itself, because the world is now unsettled, and it will be unsettled until arguably the 1820s. We can debate about whether or not it is the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but I would argue that the 7 Years' War changes things. The traditional paradigms, the traditional alliances, the traditional viewpoints, the traditional powers are all changed, either eternally or externally. They aren't a factor. They are a factor. Prussia becomes powerful, but also the alliances in Europe change. Britain goes from having an alliance which has usually been Austria, and to an extent the Ottoman Empire, and although that was always more of an alliance of convenience, to Prussia. France changes to Russia and Austria. And you can argue it's the loss of their Franco ally which causes so many issues for Napoleonic France when dealing with Austria and Russia, because they'd relied on France to keep the British busy so the British weren't causing them trouble. And then Napoleon, well, you have all the revolutions, etc., go along in France, and they are now finding themselves that they backed the wrong horse in the race. The trouble is with history, especially when we're looking back in it, people like things to be neat. They like them to fit into boxes. And they like to define them. And I think sometimes the obsession with defining terms can cause you to mix the context and the nuance of the history involved. I think you can forget the value of Frederick the Great, of Prussia, and its fight for survival in the 7 Years' War. The fact it survives at all is amazing at certain points. Because it doesn't go. And because of what we know comes next. Because of what we know comes after it. Because of what we know happens through history. If you read history backwards, you can feel great confidence and great status in doing neat divisions and definitions. If you read history forwards, the lessons you learn is the only thing you can count on is change, and the only certainty is uncertainty. There is no such thing as a definite solution. There is no such thing as a 100% guaranteed solution. There is no such thing as we can be sure this will happen. The old joke, of course, is the only thing you can be sure of in life is death and taxes. Well, that's pretty much correct. You're going to have to pay money to a government at some point. They're very good at doing it. It's like my usual and joke at this point is, what is the difference between a government and a protection racket? Most governments have been around for longer and they don't like the competition. It's not necessarily a good joke, but there again, I'm an academic. My students always laugh. I mark their papers. This is the real problem, and this is what had set the scene for the 7 Years' War. The 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. It's a wonderful treaty. It's very fair. It upsets everyone. And in many ways, it's the last gasp of the old order. And I have no idea what happened there, but it's flicked back, so I'm going to flick it forward. The world had a bitter, bitter war. But everything seemed to be settled. Everyone knew their place. And everyone was upset with that place. And the trouble is, you have a prize. 2 prizes, if you look at that map. You have the Holy Roman Empire, and you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So everyone's unhappy, and there are prizes to be had. And here comes the second joke. Why are the fights in academia always so vicious? Because the prize is so small. That is my old Professor Andrew Lambert's joke. And it's true. When there is very little to fight over, the fights become far nastier. Because there's no prizes for second place when there's only so little to go around. There's only enough for the winner. What is the difference between the 7 Years' War and the wars which come previously? Why is it a world war and the others aren't? Because in the 7 Years' War, the prize becomes not Europe, but the world. And honestly, you can argue by the time of the wars we call world wars, but really are possibly the industrialized expression and form of a total war, the world is no longer enough. And that is the problem for the Axis powers versus the Allies, or rather for Britain and America. Soviet Union hasn't caught up with it, probably due to Stalin. But the world is not enough by that point. Capitalism is not about the world as it is. Capitalism is about the world, the future. If you look at all the way the economy is structured, debt not being taxed, but income is taxed. We are constantly mortgaging the present to fund the future. The world as it is not enough. We're always constantly looking for the better tomorrow. That's the difference. They're fighting for control of the world. Britain and America are fighting for control of the world, of the future of the world. It's a different thing. But the difference is the wars prior to the 7 Years' War are arguably about jostling for power and position in terms of European preeminence. From the 7 Years' War onwards, the wars become about ruling the world. They become about not just extracting resources from the world, but they become about mobilizing the world, about using the world, about bringing the world together in a form that you can forge into your own sword, your own shield, your own cloak. It's a mindset change. It's what separates a world war from a multi-theatre war. And this is why the 7 Years' War matters. This is why the 7 Years' War comes back to it as being this step change that Corbett, that Mahan, that all these people look back at and think about and talk about and consider when they are deciding and developing their positions. Because when they're talking in World War One, they're at the end of the period where the fighting is for control of the world. That is where that is still the frame of reference. And they see it's going to change. So they are looking back at the previous time when the world changed. They are looking back the previous time when it came up for debate. And the thing is, humans, when they have debates multinationally, don't tend to involve academics having nice conversations. We'd love that. Or diplomats or politicians. It'd always be so nice to say that we are so civilized, but we're not. We might have those meetings at the fringes. We might have those meetings at the beginning. We might try and have huge conferences to discuss it and talk it through. But in the end, ultimately, it almost always seems to come down to, well, since the 1750s at least, flinging stuff at each other. The faster and hotter that stuff is that we're flinging at each other, the better. So what is the 7 Years' War ultimately about? It's about control the world. Why do so many of the land battles take place in Europe? Well, that's the point. It's about the world changing and its use changing. So the wars are still taking place in Europe. But the thing is, you can argue the power, which is divided between two political groups. One side Pitt, one side Newcastle on its head. Newcastle, the king, they're still going by the old metric of Europe, Europe, Europe. But there's this other faction, which is strong, headed by Pitt the Elder. Arguably one of the greatest prime ministers Britain has ever had. Certainly one of the best at balancing our internal political affairs, even when he wasn't prime minister. And his aim, apart from constantly having to knock heads with Le Secret de Roy, i.e. Louis XV's own special secret foreign policy, which, as he is a completely all-powerful anointed by God, non-constitutional monarch who has complete and utter total control over his government, an absolute monarchy, is kind of a weird thing to do, to actually be both conducting an official diplomacy, which you're in charge of, and a secret diplomacy, which you're in charge of, and having two entirely separate systems, and often having the two sets working against each other. Leaving that to one side, even sometimes having two sets of secret de roi working against each other, and both sets of those sets working against your official line. Oh, the man liked intrigue, what can I say? Pitt the Elder did well. And he's really the one who's sort of changing, his faction, his supporters are changing the definition of what war is, of what and why it's a world war. It's why it's definitely not corporals' guards being deployed around the world. Don't take this the wrong way, but at this point, no one would really trust a corporal to guard anything. The NCO ranks aren't what they were now, what they become, and what they became, or even what they had started out as. At this point, a corporal is probably just meaning someone who they haven't caught yet. Don't really start trusting your NCOs until they get to sergeant, possibly colour sergeant. Which is unfortunate, because they do get some smart people coming up through this NCO corps. Especially the East India Company. They like to find NCOs, smart ones from British regiments, and go, would you like a commission? You can earn enough money that when you return back to the UK, you're going to be a posh country gentleman, and you'll be able to buy a commission for your children in the regular army, and they'll get the status you never had. One of the other interesting factors going on prior to and during the 7 Years' War is, of course, the middle classes start to really stretch their legs in terms of their power and influence. And this is the difference. What do we mean by middle class? Well, I would define a middle class, especially in its early points, as people who earn enough money they can afford to have leisure time. They can afford to have days when they don't work on a regular basis. They can afford to maybe have a servant or two to assist around the house. They can afford to be fashionable. They can afford a house. You are dealing with an increasingly professionalized society. And the trouble is, when people have qualifications and are professionals, and you need them to do things, they tend to demand higher wages. And higher wages and other better terms of service, like weekends off. Like not having to work nights. All sorts of things can happen. And this has been going on for a while now. You can see it going back to the charters being, the charter towns, etc., being created in the earlier Middle Ages. You can even go back further and suggest there was certainly, well, housecarls, etc., were in the earlier Middle Ages were a version of a middle class, certainly. You go back further, you will often find them. But the point is, the middle class slowly becomes distinct in terms of its own political power. And really, in Britain, it's after the Civil War, they have really realised, yeah, because let's be honest, the British Civil War, we can argue about its causes in many, many ways, but really its causes are quite simple. the middle class were fed up with being taxed without being given a say in how the country was run. It could well be taxation, no representation, because they had a theoretical fig leaf in the Commons, but the king wasn't listening to the Commons because he believed in the absolute monarchy and the power of the royalty and the sacredness of royal blood. All those things, which were lovely, but it didn't matter to the people who were going, you're spending our money, but not asking for our input and what you're spending it on. Which is also why a large number of nobles end up joining the fight on the king, because again, they agreed with it mostly, but mostly because they depended upon the middle classes for their money. Because most nobles, who do you think was running their estates? Who do you think was running their lands? Who do you think were their lawyers, their bankers, their ship captains, their merchants that they invested, the people who ran the companies they put their capital with? Yes, I'm a lord of the land. That means you have money, but your money is all tied up in things which you have to invest in to get money out of it. Farming doesn't generate the income you'd think it would. Even sheep farming, when that's very, very good. Value for money. So the 7 Years' War is a crossroads in history point. And it's a global war. It is a world war. It takes place all around the world. Sorry, slipped out there. But, you know, it is a world war. It has all sorts of things going on. It's even affecting places like Russia and places like India. Again, another reason that's often not sort of understood and not sort of really considered in the creation of British India and French India and all these things were under the various companies. And the way they get in is by exploiting the issues between the middle classes in those countries and the ruling classes. Again, the more stratified a country is, the more stagnant it is, the more room there is for maneuver and for exploitation by outside influences wanting to get into it. You want to really put your country at risk of having outsiders take over your country. You stop talking to people and you start breaking them up into small groups. It's a problem. And you can see it throughout history. Why does Frederick the Great manage to keep Prussia together when it's under all that attack? It's because, in many respects, he is very loose in what constitutes a Prussian. He's very inclusive. Incredibly inclusive when he wants to be, into terms of what is a Prussian, and therefore who can fight in his regiments. There are more issues for countries which try to be more exclusive. Russia, of course, shows the power of female leadership in this period. The Royal Navy shows the power of having a lot of people called Edward. And I mean, they do have a lot of people called Edward. They have both Edward Boscawen and Edward Hawke, who are two principal admirals who go around basically beating up anyone they get sent to fight. Thankfully, there's also a George called Pocock, but you know, it's mostly it is Edwards, and it's quite disturbing in some operations when you're looking down the list of the captains and it goes Edward, 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 and you're going, this isn't a brothers in arms. This is Edwards in arms. But the 7 Years' War is the first war where people go into and already are thinking worldwide. They think worldwide from the beginning, they think it all the way through to the end. There are operations still ongoing everywhere in the world when the war ends. And that's the really cool thing about this as a war, but also why it is a world war and why it's so interesting to those people who study and are preparing for a world war. Because that's the other dirty little secret of the 1890s and of the 1900s. Everyone thought the next war would be a world war. No one was quite sure who would be on which factions, who would be which side, who would be fighting whom. But they all thought it was going to be a world war. The Jeu Cole, that famous French school of naval thought that ruined French shipbuilding for decades. It's an idea of how to fight a world war. It's honestly, we can't afford to have a massive battle fleet because we have to concentrate on our army. We're never going to get funding for a decent sized navy in comparison to powers who will focus on their navy because they don't have land borders to worry about. So, ergo, we need to come up with a way to both defeat their navy and achieve a level of sea control, or rather sea control, and then command the sea. Well, that's where the large armored cruisers come involved, because they're able to go out and command the sea, do commerce warfare, and show the flag around the world. Because after you've blown up the enemy battle fleet, what are they going to have that's going to be able to take on these large, powerful ships? Because, of course, the enemy's not going to copy you and build them as well as building battleships, because, well, why would they do that? They have far more money and far more exposure, so it's not, therefore far more incentive. But they're not going to do something smart like that. Something similar happens in the 7 Years' War. We look at the beginning of the standardization. It's where the Royal Navy really starts to come and starts to get a real affection for the 74 as a third rate. And it's when they start to think about, they start doing this worldwide operations, and they start thinking, we need infrastructure. And they look at things like the siege of Fort St. Philip and the fact that they failed to save it. They failed to get there. And what's interesting is this, of course, loses a critical island for the British. It loses Majorca. And the British, at the end of the war, capture Belle Isle, largely because that gives them a bargaining chip to get back Majorca. Why? Because they presume they can capture Belle Isle again. They've done it once, they'll do it a second time. They have no qualms about that, and history seems to stand them up on that one. But with Majorca, they have a major position in the Mediterranean. A major position. And most importantly, it has fresh water. It's logistics. There was other interesting discussions about the various land battles in terms of their numbers during the war. And yes, you can certainly look at some of the battles, and in terms of land battles in Europe, and you have, well, Belle-Île, of course, which has 9,000 Anglo-Prussian troops, mostly British, versus 3,000 French ones. But you do have St. Cast, which is 1,400 versus 10,000, and Willinghausen, which is 60,000 versus 100,000, and 25 Scheerdritz, which is 25,000 versus 10,000. So you have a mixture of numbers, and then you go look at them, and you look at some numbers for the others, and at the Battle of Calcutta, the Mughals, French Mughal army, puts forward a force of 40,000 troops against 1,800 largely sepoy British troops. The British win the second Battle of Calcutta. They lost the first battle. The point is, definitely more than a corporal's guard. The other paradigm shift that goes on at this point is there is a bit of a diplomatic revolution. In that, really, a lot of the diplomacy going on starts to push up and professionalize. And you see this in the treaties. There's the first and second Treaty of Versailles. There's 1756 and 1757. There's the Westminster Convention, which produces the Anglo-Prussian alliance. And there are all sorts of discussions going on between the different nations and different states to try and produce something like stability. In their favour, of course. Which isn't really stability. No scenario can be stable if one side is tipping the scales in their favour. Because by its definition, that's not a stable position to be in. But sometimes how the world works in reality versus how it will work in theory are different things, and it's the same true as stability. Sometimes both sides can believe that they have tipped the scales in their favour, and that's what matters. They believe the scales are in their favour, so therefore they feel safe and secure, so they negotiate and come first. Because that's ultimately the point. If a nation is negotiating from a position that it feels is strong, it is more likely to give concessions and less likely to react aggressively to adverse reactions. It's when a nation feels weak that it does stupid things. Stupid being the definition of, in hindsight, whenever we're looking at it backwards with 2020 vision going, how did they end up thinking like that? Japan, World War II, is a good example. They don't feel strong. Anyone reading a map and looking at the scenario of what was going on knows they were strong at the time, but also knows why they don't feel strong, because their infrastructure and their industry means they can't start building up and build up to the level equivalent to what Britain and America are doing because of the war that they're in. Well, Britain's in, and America is basically supplying, and also, strange enough, building up for. It's quite cute. There's also a level of professionalism that goes through the various armed forces at this time. Now, it might seem strange when we talk about the armies, where you can buy commissions, as having a level of professionalism, but they do have a level of professionalism, because you can't just buy an instant commission as a colonel, in theory. You have to move up the ranks. You have to serve time. You have to have experience. And to be honest, they find ways of making sure people who aren't that smart and aren't that good don't. Now, they don't always work 100%. Sometimes you meet someone who looks very smart on paper, but it's actually really, really stupid. But that's life, unfortunately. No system is 100% effective, and believing a system should be 100% effective, or can be 100% effective, often leads to problems, because if you believe a system's 100% effective, you will trust implicitly without verifying, and that's when that can lead to problems that way. And believing you can make a system 100% effective, well, that's an ego trip. It's not a reality. Settle for the high 70s. It will work. And you'll, a vast majority of the time, and you'll know that it won't always work, so you'll check just in case it's one of those times when it's not going to. This was also one of the first wars where neutral powers were involved on a worldwide scale. Sometimes as benign actors, sometimes not. Now, there is an interesting factor in that for Austria, the worst nightmare would have been actually the Ottomans probably getting involved. But it could also cause the Russians problems. Because if the Ottomans had got involved, whilst their military is not that fantastic, it's suffering from the beginnings of the problems which are certainly going to take it out of the running of the great powers already at this point. It has got still a fairly decent, fairly proficient military and armed forces that if it had decided to send into Austria's back or into Russia, could well have caused them to get into trouble. Frederick did realise this, the British did realise this, but there wasn't enough money to really make the Ottomans interested in doing it, because the Ottomans were dealing with their own internal issues. Rather sadly for them, because I think if they had got involved in these sort of wars earlier on, they might well have been forced to do reforms earlier, when they could have been done in a far more subtle and far more consensual manner, which could have brought more people with them, and B, could really interestingly change the map. There are also a lot of different uniforms. There are. And there's a lot of technological change. That's the other thing which the 7 Years' War brings about, is it sets the scene for a lot of technological change, a lot of technological developments, because people come out of the war and go, right then, what worked, what didn't work, how do we fix what didn't work so we're prepared for the next one? Because that's the thing. The next war is not that long away. The next war comes. In fact, next war is often considered, well, how do I put this? The next war is often considered to have started almost immediately 7 Years' War ends, because theoretically It's the Anglo-French War of 1778 to 1783, which does include the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. Because some of the gentlemen from the Secret de Roy and Louis XV's group start causing trouble in America almost as soon, in fact, pretty much as soon as the 7 Years' War ends. And that's what helps to set the scene for the American Revolutionary War in some respects. And they I wouldn't call them instigators of it, but certainly accelerators, and it was a reaction which was already going to happen. They don't instigate it. The scene was set during the 7 Years' War, especially with all the fighting the colonists had already done during the French and Indian War from 1754. But the point is, it accelerates what's already going to happen. I'm not sure by how much, but there is a reason there is only a 12-year gap between the 7 Years' War ending and the American Revolutionary War breaking out. And 12 years is not a long time. And then you go into an almost unbridled section of the war with the French Revolutionary War starting on from 1792. And of course, the 7 Years' War comes slap bang in the middle, really, of what is sometimes referred to as the Second 100 Years' War. And perhaps that's the point. It's the point at which the Second 100 Years' War turns from being a war for Europe into a war for the world. Where Europe is a major theatre, some might argue the decisive theatre, the critical theatre, because that's where the mother nations, the industries, etc. is based. But control of it, or power in it, is not necessarily dominance of it. Is not necessarily going to win you the war. Napoleon achieves dominance in the European theatre on many occasions, as do the French, under different leaders. And yet they don't win the wars as a whole. There are some wars they do better than others, but as a whole, they don't win them. There are also changes in strategy which come about in the 7 Years' War. It's where the Royal Navy really starts to develop its forward-facing strategy, but also where the French and other powers start to try and think of ways of how they can limit the ability of British naval power to influence events in Europe. Because they see the naval power, they see its ability to bombard the coast, its ability to launch raids, its ability to scare civilian coastal populations, and they are rightly worried about it. It's a terror weapon in that sense. And there's very little response you can make about it because armies do not move as fast on land as ships do at sea. They don't. Most importantly, where your army's based might be over here. When you get news, when the ship is spotted by that coastal town coming in, they have to come to you. You then have to get the news, digest the news, organize your troops, and get them on the road to get to there. By which time the ship might well have arrived, bombarded, and left. It might never even put any boats or sailors ashore to do anything on the shore. It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to. And there are lots of small incidents. There's also occasionally letting, well, how do I put this politely? Losing control of your troops after a siege. It's almost traditional. There are some generals and some officers who consider it abhorrent and will do whatever is necessary to restore order. There are others who consider the license for horrendous actions to be taken on a civilian population and etc. after a siege has been brought to a close by the sack, by storm, by breach, as the necessary reward for the troops who've gone through that, and the necessary intimidation factor for future towns. Seven Years' War has that as a feature. It's one of the peculiarities of our age in that every generation seems to imagine it has invented the idea of bringing war to the civilian population. It's usually the scale of taking war to the civilian population you're talking about, not the actual act of doing it. And the scale is proportional to the industrial capacity and technological era you live in, not proportional to your intent. You can argue that the intent of leaders and generals and politicians in the 1700s and 1800s was far more bloodthirsty than the politicians and leaders in the 1900s might have been on some sides. But the scale of technological prowess available to them, the capabilities that offered, allowed them to inflict far more damage than their predecessors had. But that's scale and scope of technology. It's not intent. And if we are going to define wars by technology versus intent, then we end up in a problem. We end up in a problem for military history, but we end up in a problem for study of history at all, because the technology is always changing and improving. So that means all historical lessons become moot if we base everything based on the technological capabilities, because the pure capabilities are consistently going to improve, we'd hope, not regress. Current ideas of the carrier group may be notwithstanding. But the point is, it is not the same in terms of technology. But that doesn't mean the lessons aren't valid, because the lessons are about waging war. So we have to base it off intent. To put it another way, just because if I was sitting in a command post now, I could press a button and launch a load of missiles and strike targets around the world, well, that means is that if that is the current capability, I can strike anywhere in the world from one place where I press one button. You could therefore make the case that there's been no truly world war, because at no point has anyone struck anywhere from one place, because that's the current technological level. But the 17th century version, that would be, well, if I want to hit land targets, I'm going to have to send an army there. The 17th and 18th century, going to have to send an army there. If they're along the shore, I can give a letter to various naval officers, and they can go and bombard it with their cannon Go, do. Intent's the same. They probably kill a lot less people. They don't have nuclear weapons. They don't have this. But it's still a world war, and it's still an attack on civilian people, a civilian population. It's the methodology and technology of it that's changed, but not the intent. I would also argue the 7 Years' War is the first war which has some really interesting ideas about civilian populations and what will break them. In that, how do I put this? Propaganda has been a feature of warfare for a while by this point. But actually trying to actively send pamphlets, etc., through enemy lines has been an idea, but in the 7 Years' War, they turn it into an art form. They actually take some of this stuff and really do set up printing presses and discussion points, which is also conversely where quite a lot of our information comes from, because a lot of the accounts written about these things, etc., are designed to be circulated around to sing the praises of your troops and your victories to your opponents and to your own populace, to keep morale high and in your supporters, and take morale, hopefully undermine morale in your enemies. It had been an idea. It has been around for a while. Trust me, it's been around for a while, even by that point. Basically, as soon as someone came with the idea of the printing press, and it turned from we must hand scribe and hand produce copies to next. It's not fun, but you can keep it going for a while. Pretty much as soon as that point, someone's gone, I have a cunning plan. It's also possibly the 7 Years' War, which arguably shows the Prussians, and therefore the Germans, that they need their own navy. And leaves them with the psychological impact of what happens when they don't have a navy, and long term, leaves them the idea that they can't always rely on the British. Because they can't, because the British have their own interests. The British own interests do not include annoying Sweden to the point at which they won't sell us naval stores. The Royal Navy is not in the business of annoying its primary foreign suppliers. It needs those stores in the Baltic. Which also gives the Royal Navy rather a good understanding of the Baltic, which is something which then should feature in your discussions when considering, well, the various Copenhagenings that have happened, and also the First World War. The Royal Navy had a long-term relationship with the Baltic, which had started a long time prior to the 7 Years' War, but which is a feature of the 7 Years' War in terms of their actions and why they have ships going off elsewhere and they don't have ships they are trying to avoid sending into the Baltic. Not because of upsetting Russia. They're not really worried about upsetting Russia. Sweden. Sweden is the one they don't want to upset. Because they want supplies. And that's the trouble. Prussia's fighting Sweden. No. The other problem that was raised was that it can't be a world war because there weren't decisive battles fought around the world. Well, there were a fair number of decisive battles in terms of their locality. But a decisive battle is what? Are you using the definition from the Kantai-Kessen? Are you using the definition of Trafalgar, where you sink or capture the vast majority of the enemy fleet? Or are you using a definition where you achieve your strategic aims as being decisive? Because that is certainly strategically decisive. The point is, It's complicated. And it's nuanced. And it's something which should be discussed and debated. And ultimately, the Battle of Quiberon Bay, if any battle sets a template for what Trafalgar is in the end turns out to be, it's this battle. And set by Edward Hawke, who of course was Nelson's hero. Horatio Nelson's hero. Now that's a claim to fame. Also, I have reviewed some very good books about this battle in Book or Two to review, so I highly recommend you go check them out. There's always some planning to invade Britain. It just becomes a constant. Anyway. Got pretty much through my script for Long Patrol, so on the subject, so I'm going to skip through this. Patron December vote topics. As you can see, the votes were many and varied. Not really. There are 3 which get an overwhelming number of votes, and I'm talking about 20 for Carl Henshaw's, 17 for Ian Carr's, and 15 for Wayne Borean's. One of Wayne Borean's. Strange enough, Bitron's Thrawn one only got 7 votes. 7 and 8 seem to be quite a popular number, as did 2 and 3. The Maritime Lessons of the Peloponnesian War only got 9. I'm sorry, Bale. But what we have got is how was the British night fighting doctrine developed for, and then in practice during World War II. That's what was over and above all the winner from Carl Henshaw. We have Ian Carr, what if Courageous and Glorious had survived, and what changes would have resulted on our end, carrier practice and strategy. And you'll notice I've got a 3rd one bolded. I've got Wayne Borean's strategic and tactical thinking on RN submarines and RN anti-submarine forces between the wars. Well, that's because I've done this. So, those are going to be this month's free patrons. They are going to be what we're going to be looking at. You'll also notice in Long Patrols, we've got the Challenger expedition coming up. And I've got a little bit of a message there. On the 12th of December, do you want to have a live on the Pearl Harbor video topic? Because there have been a few comments already about it. And if you do, I will change it from Brewship 64 to Pearl Harbor, a product of the Canada Keston Doctrine or something to do, and we will have a live and a discussion. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you. Take care.